On April the 10th, 1815, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia marks the beginning of a global disaster.
The 1815 eruption of Tambora has been the largest eruption in historic time.
On the island, the volcano kills at least 100,000 people, more than any other eruption in human memory. But this is only the beginning. The eruption causes worldwide climate change. In the northern hemisphere, rain and freezing temperatures lead to dramatic crop failures. Famine spreads to many parts of Europe. Those who can afford it try to emigrate, and those who stay fight for survival or revolt.
After Tambora, there was crackdown by the authorities across Europe.
But revolts and famine are not the only problem.
Terrible diseases killed hundreds of thousands of people.
Enhanced by the chaotic weather conditions, a killer bug spreads across the globe. Cholera becomes the plague of the 19th century.
If you look at this particular suggestion,
it was an epidemic raging out of control.
How could a single volcano at the other end of the world cause so many riots and so much death and agony? Many generations are affected by the aftermath of this climate change. It even shapes the Industrial Revolution and leads to political reforms in many countries. 200 years after its eruption, historians, geoscientists, climatologists, and geneticists are together investigating for the first time how this volcano has changed the world. London, the British capital. Historian Gillan Darcy Wood from the University of Illinois is tracking down the global impact of the Tambora outbreak. His mission? To find out how this natural disaster has influenced the 19th century in different parts of the world. The Tate Gallery hosts the largest collection of British art of that era. It includes works of art of famous Romanticist landscape painter John Constable. His cloud depictions have become an important piece of evidence of the global weather turmoil that followed the eruption of Tambora.
Constable sees himself as a kind of scientist of the skies, as a painterly meteorologist. The history of European landscape painting up until this time, the background at the horizon and the sky has been more or less decorative or ornamental, with generic depictions of clouds. The way in which Constable's style converges with the story of Tambora is that owing to Tambora's eruption, the 18 teens are the cloudiest and wettest decade of the millennium.
But at the time, people in Europe had not yet realized that the origin of their misery was to be found on the other side of planet Earth. On the Indonesian island of Sumbawa, the volcano Tambora. 200 years after its violent eruption, rainforest once again covers the flanks of the volcano. Today, the crater rim is 2,850 meters above sea level and hardly gives the impression of a vicious force that once emerged from this point of the Earth. In sight of the volcano, Ralph Gertiser from Britain's University of Kiel is searching for traces. The geologist has been working on Tambora for many years and is one of the handful of experts who conduct on-site research. His aim? To reconstruct exactly the course and extent of the eruption.
So with this laser rangefinder, I can measure the height of the cliff in front of us, which is made up of the pyroclastic flow deposits of the 1815 eruption, and we have here about 9 meters of deposits.
These vast quantities of material originate from a mountain that was once more than 4,000 meters high, one of the highest peaks in Indonesia. The volcano had been dormant for centuries before it suddenly awoke in 1815. At that time, nobody knew that the Tambora would seal the fate of the inhabitants in just a few days. "200 years later, archaeologists search for traces of these people. For a long time, there have been indications that a now extinct nation once lived here. Archaeologists already refer to it as Pompeii of the East. Similar to the ancient Roman city, a whole settlement was surprised by a hot avalanche of ash. Buried under it, the life of these people might be frozen, like in Pompeii. In recent years, 4 buildings have already been discovered during the excavation. It is an archaeological mega-project that is still in its infancy.
We want to learn more about the culture of the people of Tambora. We have scanned about 8 hectares on this slope to find the best site for our excavation. There seem to be 86 buildings in this area, so there must have been an entire village here beneath us. It was probably quite a large village.
Hamburg. Scientists at the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology have simulated the impacts of the Tambora outburst on the computer. Their goal, using modern scientific methods, they want to find out in which regions of the world temperatures and precipitations dramatically changed at the time. Different scenarios were calculated. Almost all of them show severe disturbances in global weather systems.
A volcano is literally a hammer on the Earth system. You hit the system and then something happens. And the Tambora is a relatively big hammer compared to previous volcanic eruptions.
The German Climate Computing Center conducts the simulations for the scientists. Using a supercomputer that fills an entire story, processes of the Earth's atmosphere are calculated from ground to high altitudes. Models which are normally used to look into the future now show how the eruption in 1815 could have influenced the world's climate. Essential for such calculations are the location of eruption, the point in time, its duration, the amount of sulfur gases, and to what height they are catapulted. In the case of Tambora, at least 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide penetrated the stratosphere at over 20 kilometers. Upper winds distributed the cloud around almost the entire planet. In many regions, the average annual temperature fell sharply. At the British Library, Gill and Darcy Wood wants to verify whether the calculations of the climatic researchers coincide with the reality of that period. He finds a source that sheds a whole new light on the impact of the Tambora eruption. It leads to a region that researchers had barely considered before, Bengal in northeast India. It is a medical book of British physician James Jameson. He was commissioned by the British government to report about cholera outbreaks which were accumulating in the region. But his documentation begins with about 80 pages of detailed weather protocols, the most meticulous description of the impact of the Tambora eruption available to today's historians. Jameson's recordings clearly show that since 1816, the change of dry and monsoon seasons, typical and essential for India, is completely mixed up.
Towards the end of May, the weather had become so oppressive that the thermometer sometimes rose as high as 98, an unusual height in Bengal, and many individuals, both Europeans and natives, dropped down dead in the streets. About the end of the first week of September, this unwanted drought gave way and was succeeded by very heavy rain.
Had an interest in meteorology, an interest in medicine, interest in public health, and in this case in humanitarian disaster. And he saw himself as a writer who charged with capturing all of these things in one text.
May 1816. At this time of year, strong monsoon winds from the sea bring heavy rains every day. But this year not a drop has fallen. The land suffers from a severe drought. The reason? It is cooler than usual. The difference in temperature between sea and land is too small to absorb humid air from the sea. The fields are extremely dry. the poor rural population is threatened by a massive crop failure. Then comes the turning point. At the end of August, 3 months later than usual, the wind brings the long-desired rain. But it is disastrous, even for Indian conditions. The rivers overflow. Valuable farmlands are washed away. Over a period of 2 years, the weather turbulences continue. James Jameson documented them accurately. He thus became the foremost chronicler of severe monsoonal system disturbance in living memory.
It's kind of a heroic achievement that he is able to really take a deep breath and attempt, in the midst of it all, to try to make some sense of what was happening around him, through observation, through the accumulation of data, and then through an imaginative, very creative and very humanistic attempt to try to create a full picture of what had occurred in those years, which otherwise would be lost to history.
In Bengal, the chaotic weather sows the seeds for particularly strong cholera outbreaks, which would soon write history worldwide. In the nutrient-rich brackish water of the flat coast, cholera bacteria have always lived as a natural part of the ecosystem. During the monsoon, the many rivers of the region transport large amounts of nutrients into the sea. Carpets of plankton develop on the water surface. Following 1816, an unprecedented change of unusually long, dry and rainy seasons leads to plankton and cholera bacteria multiplying explosively. Due to the high concentration and a particularly widespread of the pathogens, more people than ever before are infected. Within a few days, the disease leads to life-threatening fluid depletion and often death.
Soon the disease extended itself in every direction, within the area of several thousand miles. Thus, in so short a period brought under its influence, few towns or villages of any considerable size wholly escaped its attacks. The old and the young, the European and the native, fighting men and camp followers were alike subject to its visits, and all equally sunk in a few hours under its most powerful grasp.
The traditional steps to the river Ganges, the Ghats, were filled with funeral pyres, essentially burning around the clock. And we have many ghoulish and almost terrifying descriptions of the constant burning of the dead by the rivers, corpses floating in the river, and really a scene of dreadful human calamity that overtook Bengal. It was an epidemic raging out of control.
Ralph Gertizer is on his way to the Tambora. Only with a helicopter can he reach the inside of the deep crater. Today, Sumbawa is a tropical paradise with rainforest and coral reefs. But the sleeping giant can always awaken. The volcanologist has once reached the edge of the crater after a walk of 7 days. But he knows there is no way into this huge caldera. For Gertizer, it is a long-cherished dream to stand on the floor of the caldera. Finally, the landing on the crater floor, certainly where few can have been before, if any. He doesn't have much time because the helicopter pilot won't risk stopping the engine. If the helicopter doesn't start, they are cut off. Inside the caldera, they cannot call for help. Gertizer walks to the foot of the caldera wall to take his measurements. This shows which elemental force is still dominant under the surface.
Standing here on the floor of the 1815 caldera is certainly a highlight and something every volcanologist would like to see, and it's one of those sites everybody is dreaming of seeing, and it's spectacular, and certainly one of the most spectacular sites in the world. After the 1815 eruption, there was still signs of volcanic activity at Tambora. So clearly Tambora is still active, as can also be seen so behind us, where sort of volcanic gases come out of the ground. The predominant component of these gases is water vapor. You can see elementary sulfur precipitating out of these gases, and the sulfur is clearly derived from molten rock or magma inside the volcano, which is degassing off the ground along the caldera wall.
Today, the edge of the volcano is about 3,000 meters high. This means that the mountain has lost about 1,200 meters, a third of its height, due to the powerful eruption. The whole island was devastated by the unbelievably powerful explosion and buried under meters of thick deposit. But why such a gigantic eruption arose without a warning, and whether this can happen again, remains completely unclear. Because of its secluded location, volcanologists have hardly explored Tambora. Now Ralf Gertiser wants to finally understand the history of the volcano, using rock samples from different layers. He can read these deposits like a book.
So by collecting samples from the 1815 deposits, we can infer quite a lot about the processes that occurred inside the volcano before the eruption happened. For example, we can infer how deep the magma reservoir was inside the volcano that fed the eruption. We can infer the gas or volatile content of the magma and how much volatile or gas was released during the 1815 eruption into the atmosphere. We can learn about how long the magmas which erupted in 1815 were residing inside this magma reservoir, inside the volcano, before the eruption occurred.
At the University of Berkeley in California, Gertiser's colleague Stephen Self examines the samples of the Tambora material. Even the smallest rock particles can show how old the mountain is and which chemical composition the magma had during the eruption. The experts know that the key to the long-term effects is what kind of magma is under a volcano and finally pushes to the surface. In the case of Tambora, it is particularly important to know how much sulfur was in the magma.
That's what I use all the time.
The 1815 magma from Tambora had a pretty average sulfur content, typical for the composition of the magma. It has 600 or 700 parts per million of sulfur, which is pretty standard. But there was a huge amount of magma, and much more than any recent eruption, and therefore the total amount of sulfur released was very large.
April 2015. Leading scientists from various specialities, including Stephen Self and Gillen Darcy Wood, came to Switzerland to discuss the Tambora outbreak. What new insights have historians gained? What do geologists know? And what are the consequences of volcanic eruptions for the climate? Substantial progress has already been made.
We've come to understand the connection between volcanic eruptions and climate fairly well thanks to the Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines in 1991.
At that time, the Pinatubo comes alive on the Philippine island of Luzon after 550 years. About 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide are released. As in the case of Tambora, it rises up into the stratosphere and causes a temperature drop of about 0.5 degrees in the following months.
There have been hundreds of studies of the Pinatubo eruption, and that understanding has been applied back to much earlier eruptions like Tambora. So we've reached quite a sophisticated understanding of the basics of how the climate system operates, in a sense, to this forcing of the volcanic aerosol.
Volcanic aerosols are tiny droplets composed of sulfur and water. They evolve in the stratosphere from the sulfur gas of the eruption and reflect part of the incident sunlight, spreading the rest, and additionally absorbing energy. As a result, less heat reaches the Earth's surface. Temperatures drop. Only after several years do the suspended particles slowly sink to the ground. During this time, the aerosol fog of Tambora also causes blazing sunsets and exceptional color displays in the sky, an effect which also captured the imagination of famous English Romanticist painter William Turner. Not only his paintings show that, his watercolors also display the unreal-looking colors of the sky, with a few brushstrokes right up to violet and pink tones, as he tries to document this moment as quickly as possible. For Gillen Darcy Wood, yet more proof of the extraordinary weather conditions of these years, which repeatedly directed people's gaze to the sky.
We can almost look at these paintings as a metaphor for an increased sensitivity toward the idea of change, not only in human political systems, but in the Earth system as well. To understand them fully, we need to attempt to make that leap of historical imagination to understand them as momentary, powerful encounters with a world of extreme weather and a world of dynamic and disastrous change.
The Museum of Bread Culture in Ulm, Germany, has records of these catastrophic years in southern Germany. The young kingdom of Württemberg was particularly affected by the climatic turbulences.
We know today that in 1816 there was a very bad harvest because of strange weather caprioles. So the year without summer has literally gone down in history. There was very bad weather, many storms, very little sun, and consequently a dramatic crop failure.
For the farmers, the spring had already been extremely cold and wet, so they could not sow their seeds until the end of April. Some merchants had taken advantage of this situation and had been traveling from village to village looking for a good deal. In the Swabian Alps, people were very pious and optimistic. Therefore, many farmers sold their supplies, believing it was good trade. But it was the merchants who benefited. The value of their goods multiplied in the coming months. They got rich quickly, very rich, and the population hatefully called them grain usurer, someone charging exorbitant amounts.
This whole thing was 200 years ago. We have really good documentation. For example, we have a screwable coin in our exhibition that includes miniature pictures and texts describing the famine. And we see in particular, in almost every image, scenes of this dramatic situation.
Fast auf jedem Bild eben diese dramatische Himmelssituation.
Thunderstorms and an incredibly dark sky. So the people were really concerned by this climate change and the incomprehensibly strange weather that they hadn't experienced before.
Summer 1816, near Lake Geneva, a young British couple, both aspiring literati, escaped from the island to pay a visit to a friend, Lord Byron. But their trips into the countryside are thwarted by abnormally cold weather. The couple have come directly into the epicenter of Europe's period of poor weather. Eastern Switzerland is faced with a total failure of its harvest. As a consequence, farmers leave the barren mountain region and travel through the country in desperate search of something to eat. Lord Byron brings his visitors to safety, away from beggars and the next storm.
An almost perpetual rain confines us principally to the house. One night, we enjoyed a finer storm than I had ever before beheld. The lake was lit up when a pitchy blackness succeeded, and the thunder came in frightful bursts over our heads amid the blackness.
These records are from 18-year-old Mary Goodwin, later to become known as Mary Shelley. The young author laid the foundation for a literary work marking the birth of modern horror literature.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
It is a story of a scientist who creates a monster in a stormy night, Frankenstein. But the people who are not that wealthy experience the real horror of these months. In Switzerland, France, and southern Germany, the situation worsens. Because the harvest fails, people steal out of sheer desperation. For many years, people have stopped having regular meals. Due to the lack of nutrition, the body's defenses are unable to cope. They're completely exhausted. Hundreds of thousands are affected in Central Europe.
Over
50% of the households were really poor and suffered from hunger, and this is, of course, very, very high. Many people died from starvation. In the wake of the famine, there were also terrible epidemics that hundreds of thousands of people died from.
Natürlich auch Hunderttausende von Menschen gestorben.
The Trail of Tambora even leads to Philadelphia, a million-strong metropolis on the east coast of America. Surrounded by skyscrapers, the College of Physicians is home to the Mutter Museum, which hosts one of the most important historical medical collections in the United States. Amidst bizarre medical preparations, paleogeneticist Hendrik Poinard has come across unique traces that reveal how much the Tambora eruption has written history even decades later. Many preparations date back to a time when tissues and organs were still preserved in alcohol and not in formalin. Thus, the remnants of pathogens that would otherwise have been destroyed have been preserved.
What do we have here?
Intestinal pieces of cholera victims are also part of the collection. They originate from a cholera epidemic which affected Philadelphia in 1849 and claimed more than 1,000 victims.
Cholera is strictly a disease of the gut, so there's no way to get it from skeletal material. So there's really almost no way to study the history of cholera from a normal skeletal cholera burial, for example, which exist actually all over the globe. You can find cholera pits. This was, a dream come true for us because we could actually sample these collections, and then using the technology that we use to pull out these small snippets of DNA, we could actually reconstruct this genome.
What's surprising, analysis of the genotype of these cholera bacteria reveals a direct link to those cholera epidemics reported by James Jameson in 1816 from Bengal.
It was quite clear that this is a strain that had its origin sitting in the Indian subcontinent and then spreads by, as we know today, by travel, trade, boats, shipping companies that eventually then seed these cholera human-specific adapted strains into the New World and parts of Europe, basically across the globe. It goes from a localized epidemic in the Indian subcontinent to this larger pandemic worldwide.
First, soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims spread the cholera in Southeast Asia. After that, it continued on to the Philippines, Japan, and China. Eventually, it spread across the land and sea routes westwards to Persia and from there to Russia. In the early 1830s, it reached Central Europe and finally England by sea, and also North and South America. After the outbreak of Tambora, cholera had become a global killer for the first time, causing the deaths of millions of people.
The 1853 outbreak. So what happens is...
London was particularly badly affected by cholera. With 5 million inhabitants, it was the largest city in the world at the time. Posters warned of the lethal epidemic. Its breeding grounds were worker slums, often built on former swamps near the Thames. There was poverty and catastrophic hygienic conditions. Following 1832, more than 30,000 people died in London as a result of several epidemics.
When you have a problem like cholera, you have a really difficult problem that can only be addressed on a pan-London scale. Everyone working together really wasn't going to happen until the Great Stink. The Thames got to such a disgusting state that quite literally the awful smell of all of this sewage in London's river arrived at the doors of the House of Parliament. And the politicians had to do something in their own self-interest. So they helped to create the London Metropolitan Board of Works that would create this grand intercepting sewer to try and clean up the Thames and help to solve the problem of cholera.
A comprehensive and connected sewage system proved to be key in the fight against cholera.
Before that solved these public health problems across the whole of London.
Much of the sewage flowed out of the city through the canal network and further east to the River Thames. Such measures finally defeated cholera in many parts of the world. However, it has not yet been eradicated.
Cholera will essentially always be with us. There is no eradication of cholera because cholera itself has a variable genetic structure that enables it to adapt to all sorts of aquatic environments. But what is becoming clearer and clearer in the 21st century is that the moments of vulnerability faced by human populations in their relationship to cholera is framed by, driven by climatic conditions and climatic change.
In Indonesia, Ralph Geertizer is on his way to the archaeology excavation site. He is curious about what they've found so far. The excavation is progressing well and brings new findings to light. The team headed by Sonny Wibisono has exposed another building. Based on the remains, the archaeologists know that the building was built on stilts and the walls were decorated with palm braid. At the rear is the kitchen, recognizable by the stones that mark the fireplace. But next to the fireplace, Chief Archaeologist Geertizer would like to show something different that surprised him. It is a fatal victim. It is the 5th skeleton that has been found so far.
So here we have obviously the
Peculiar, these bones are less charred than in previous findings.
And then another.
It is also confusing that no other victims were found in that building, although it was inhabited by a large family.
Maybe the people who lived here have left the village in advance. Maybe some escaped during the first eruption phase on April 5th. This could mean that there were only a few people left in the village when it was destroyed. And this could explain why we have found only a handful of victims so far.
Gradually, the scientists are able to get an accurate picture of the volcanic eruption. Back then, Tambora was a huge mountain that rose up about 4,200 meters. Beneath this, about 1,000 meters below sea level, is a bulging magma chamber. On the 5th of April 1815, small earth tremors led to a first discharge. At the beginning, the people underestimate the danger. Although ash is falling on their village, they do not flee. But 5 days later, the situation is worsening.
At the climax of the eruption on the 10th of April 1815, we had a huge explosion. Volcanic particles, ash and pumice and gases were ejected about 43 kilometers up into the atmosphere.
The earth quakes, the volcano rumbles, No one knows what this means. The people have only a few hours to live.
After 2 to 3 hours, this eruption column collapsed completely and traveled across the ground as a ground-hugging avalanche of pumice, ash and hot gases at velocities of 100 to 200 kilometers per hour. And these so-called pyroclastic flows wiped out everything in their path and was the phenomenon that led to the more than 10,000 direct victims of the 1815 eruption.
Traces of the Tambora disaster can also still be found in Greenland. The glaciers of the polar island have preserved them as an archive of climatic history. In the years after the eruption, the aerosols slowly sank down from the stratosphere. Snowflakes crystallized on these particles and transported them to the Greenland ice sheet, where they were enclosed. Using drills, the scientists are able to collect valuable ice samples at depths of several meters. Back-breaking work in the service of climate research that is only possible a few weeks a year. The outcome, ice cores which allow the scientists to go further back in time and to better understand the climate of the past. The Alfred Wegener Institute in Bremerhaven, Germany. Researchers from all over the world gather in this special laboratory to study ice samples from the polar regions of the Earth at -20 degrees. But before the ice reveals its information, the scientists have to cut up the core, polish it, and analyze the crystal structure. By measuring the conductivity of the ice core, the researchers are able to locate a clear indication of the 1815 eruption. It concludes that such a volcanic eruption would lead to massive losses in the global economy.
The Tambora eruption is something that affected human society, particularly in Europe. If we have something like this in the future, how are we going to respond to that? And if you imagine the amount of aerosol, the amount of dust in the atmosphere all over the planet for maybe 2 years, you could say no air traffic for 2 years, what would that effect would that have on our society? So it's really important to know the size of these eruptions and how frequent they occur. And the ice cores are the only place that we get that information from.
In fact, these ice cores come from an even more remote region than Greenland, from the interior of Antarctica. Even here, the researchers detect the fingerprint of Tambora. The ice cores are also of great importance for the reconstruction of volcanic eruptions, as they cover large periods of time.
If we look back in the past, how frequent were volcanic eruptions the size of Tambora? In the last 200 years, the Tambora volcano is the most important eruption of our recent past. The Kauai eruption in 1458 is another very large one, and then we have a series of eruptions in the 1250s, and before then there's many eruptions that you can look at back through time.
Therefore, large eruptions with global consequences are far more common than previously thought. Mankind has probably experienced several such crises, and the Tambora will not be the last. The sudden change of climate and subsequent famine result in a first wave of emigration from southern Germany. In Ulm, hundreds of emigrants travel down the River Danube in simple wooden boats called Ulmer Schachteln. They follow the invitation of the Russian Tsar, who promised the prospective emigrants land and Russian citizenship. Over 8,000 people are starting a new life in Russia and are lucky. The Danubian Delta and Black Sea coast are among the few regions in the world that are not affected by weather turmoils. Many people seek their fortune on the other side of the Atlantic in the United States. But most of them are waiting for the next disaster to strike. After the outbreak of Tambora, the east coast of the young nation especially was struggling with weather turbulences. This is even confirmed by Thomas Jefferson's records of harvest yields, as Gill and Darcy Wood has found. For many years, the former US president and father of the Declaration of Independence in Virginia has been running his Plantage Monticello in the comparatively mild climate of the region. It has yielded much profit so far. A deceptive idyll. From 1816 onwards, drought, cold and storms repeatedly destroy parts of his harvest. 1816 goes down in American history as one of the coldest years. In the hope of better weather, Jefferson continues to take out new loans and eventually goes bankrupt. The whole east coast of the US is affected by this weather catastrophe, with drastic consequences.
After 1816, the United States witnessed a massive demographic upheaval. Economic refugees from New England and down the Atlantic seaboard abandoning their farms and villages and moving en masse westward. It's the first large-scale westward migration in US history.
However, it was Indonesia that suffered the most from the consequences. Even at a distance of 500 kilometers from the volcano, the ashes had buried everything beneath it. The livelihoods of the rural population were destroyed for decades. The people who had escaped the ash flow now had hunger as an enemy, and it was merciless. It is estimated that over 100,000 people died as the indirect consequence of the eruption in Indonesia. Several ethnic groups on the island became extinct. Even the fishing industry could not compensate for the food shortage, as volcanic ash had also completely disturbed the sea's ecosystem. The result, the coasts were poisoned, the fish died. Since then, nature has long conquered the island Sumbawa. Today, trees are once again covering the site up to the summit of Tambora. Long since, people have settled back again at the foot of the mountain. But the sleeping giant lurks in the background. Volcanologists are sure that it will erupt again, but no one knows when and with what intensity.
We now start to understand the 1815 eruption now in a much better way, but we know very little about the eruptive history and the older eruptions of Tambora. And with the lack of knowledge of the eruptive history of Tambora, it's very difficult to assess sort of what processes actually lead to such a powerful eruption as in 1815.
In Europe, the consequences of the eruption continue to worsen. Every day, people die of harmless infectious diseases. The necrology states they died from emaciation. Fortunat Fowler, a priest from Sigmaringen in Germany, looks desperately at how the people of his congregation are suffering, starving and dying. Although without them really believing, he tries to preach hope to the people, but without success. Together with his cousin, he is looking for a solution. Maybe the forest could provide nutritious herbs, roots or fruits as an alternative to madly expensive bread made of pure grain. They start to experiment, but almost all attempts fail.
Man hat natürlich versucht, Brot zu strecken, dass man einfach.
Of course, they tried to dilute bread by simply mixing ingredients into it, which were not nutritious at all, such as sawdust or grasses, and other things that simply gave the feeling of a full stomach. It is a feeling of repletion, and that is already worth something.
Und das ist schon mal was wert.
In the Museum of Bread Culture in Ulm, writings prove that several contemporary witnesses were searching for new recipes. As Fortunat Fowler and his cousin knead potatoes in the dough, it marks a turning point in their experiments. Looking back, the potato bread was perhaps the most important culinary invention of the 19th century in southern Germany. Potato bread also succeeded because the potato harvest, contrary to the grain harvest, had not suffered a total loss. A baker could offer potato bread much cheaper than comparable nutritious flour bread. Also, King Wilhelm I of Württemberg wanted to reduce the suffering of his subjects, copied the formula, and distributed it among the people.
König Wilhelm verstand so eine Symbolpolitik sehr gut.
King Wilhelm understood the symbolism of such a policy very well.
Und andere soziale Maßnahmen ergriffen und damit eine
He set up food supplies for the poor and other social initiatives, and thus created a very positive mood which was communicated to the population. That policy is actually there. It exists to support the common people so that they feel they can trust the government to take the right action.
Auch die richtigen Maßnahmen ergreift.
Whereas in France, the famine causes riots in some regions. Many of the insurgents have witnessed the French Revolution, and so they try to get possession of food with well-tried means. However, in this case, the victims are not political elites, but traders and merchants. The longer the famine lasted, the more politically charged the topic of crop failure became. Also in England, as newspaper reports show.
The greatest threat to Europe was not the extreme weather itself, but its impact on food yields, on agriculture, and reporting in the newspapers becomes more conflicted and political. In fact, the government of Lord Liverpool in Britain in 1816 suppressed its usual publication of grain yields and crop yields in the summer and fall of 1816, precisely because they did not want this information widely known. They did not want panic.
One measure to reduce the distress was the construction of Regent's Canal in North London. It was built between 1816 and 1819 to give the many unemployed and the starving poor an income.
The idea is that you better connect agricultural production with market towns so that in future events of food shortages and economic distress, that cities like London would be better connected. Prior to the late 18 teens and the Tamboran emergency, governments felt no such responsibility toward their citizens. So we see the beginning of a new era of proactive government intervention and involvement in social improvement and public works and humanitarian relief.
Nevertheless, first the tensions in the population grew. The reason, despite the crisis, the politicians in the Houses of Parliament refused to withdraw a controversial law that heavily taxed grain and kept prices high, the Corn Law. Even so, the situation gets out of control, and massive riots in London and other English cities follow. Culminating in the Peterloo Massacre in Manchester.
You have crowds of unarmed women and children set upon by guardsmen on horses wielding swords and machetes who are slicing their way through the crowd. You have a death toll in the dozens. It's one of the most notorious instances of state violence inflicted on the British population in the years after Waterloo. Peterloo Massacre energises progressive and reformist forces in Britain. It exposes the corruption and violence of the ruling classes in England, and eventually leading to a more liberal social regime coming out of 1832 and the Reform Bill.
The eruption of Tambora 200 years ago. It has almost been forgotten, but today scientists are deciphering how it has made history. In the years following the eruption, the world experienced a severe crisis. However, many achievements grew out of distress, riots, and diseases. The fear of cholera pushed the elites to install a sewage system in large cities. Without functioning sewage, there would not be any modern megacities as we know them today. The first emigration waves of the 19th century were induced by the sudden climate change and accelerated the expansion of the United States to the west. Due to the fear of starving masses, important political reforms were launched in Europe. They have advanced the creation of the welfare state. All these developments have a direct link to the volcano that changed the world.